The sheriff left her bleeding on the jail floor with a newborn, but a bounty hunter took her in without asking for her name. Arizona Territory, 1874. The town of Dry Creek lay silent beneath a pale moon, its streets deserted but for the echo of boots on warped planks. Inside the sheriff's jailhouse, the air was thick with sweat and the ragged breaths of a woman fighting both labor and despair. Clara Monroe clung to the iron bars, her dark hair plastered to her forehead, blood spreading across the stone floor beneath her. Barely 25, she looked more ghost than living. The sheriff, William Hargrove, stood outside her cell, his star badge catching the lantern glow. His voice was as cold as iron when he told her the child would die with her. That Dry Creek had no use for a woman who had murdered her husband for land. Clara's voice cracked but held defiance. She swore before God she was innocent, that men under the sheriff's watch had taken her husband. Hargrove only sneered, spitting tobacco onto the floor. No one would believe her, he said. By sunrise, she and the child would be nothing but a stain. Then he walked away, spurs jingling, the heavy door slamming shut. Clara collapsed against the wall, a scream tearing from her throat. Moments later, the thin wail of a newborn split the silence. She pulled the child close, tears falling into its damp hair as she whispered prayers no one would hear. The door creaked again. This time the steps were steady, deliberate. A tall man entered, the stench of dust and blood clinging to him. Over his shoulder hung the lifeless body of an outlaw, dropped onto the desk without ceremony. Elias Kane. His name carried weight in the territory. A bounty hunter with no mercy. His gray eyes were carved from grief, his silence harder than steel. They swept the room without expression until they landed on Clara and her newborn. The deputy, half drunk at the desk, muttered that the sheriff would pay in the morning. Elias ignored him. His boots echoed as he approached the cell. Clara looked up, pale and trembling, clutching her child like a shield. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking, "do not let him take my baby. I have no one left." Elias stared without speaking. The child's fist waved weakly, its cry piercing the air. Something flickered in his expression, buried deep beneath scars. Without a word, he reached for the keys on the peg. The deputy lurched upright, protesting, but Elias's revolver was already drawn, its barrel glinting in the lamplight. His low voice cut through the room, ordering silence. The deputy froze. The lock screeched as Elias opened the cell. Clara recoiled at first, clutching the child tighter, but then Elias knelt, and to her shock, he lifted the infant from her arms. His scarred hands cradled the baby with a gentleness that left her speechless. Why would you help me?" she whispered. His eyes met hers, cold and unreadable. "Because the law does not mean justice." Then he slid his arm beneath her frail body, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. She gasped, clutching at his coat for balance. With the child against his chest, he strode from the cell, his silhouette framed in the doorway against the storm outside. The deputy sputtered threats, but none dared move. In the corridor, Sheriff Hargrove appeared, his eyes narrowing with fury as he watched Elias vanish into the rain. Half conscious against his chest, Clara whispered again, barely audible above the storm. "Why would you help me?" Elias did not look down. Rain ran off the brim of his hat. His words were gravel in the night. "Because the law does not mean justice." He carried her into the storm, leaving behind the sheriff's burning glare and the blood-stained floor where her cries had begun. Elias Kane did not see himself as a savior. He was a man hardened by grief, who had once knelt in the ashes of his home over the lifeless bodies of his wife and child, massacred in a raid lawman had called order. Since that day he had trusted no badge, no law, no man. Yet tonight, without asking her name, he had taken a bleeding woman and her newborn into his arms. And in that choice, though he would not admit it, the road he walked had shifted. The rain had begun to ease when Elias carried Clara and her newborn through the creaking door of the jailhouse. Lantern light flickered behind them, then faded as the wind swept down Dry Creek's crooked street. Clara stirred weakly in his arms, her breath shallow. The child bundled against her chest beneath Elias's coat. But the silence did not last. Words spread like wildfire. Doors banged open, boots struck mud, and voices rose sharp with anger. By the time Elias reached the main street, a crowd had gathered, torches and lanterns casting their faces into savage light. Clara lifted her head, her heart twisting as she recognized them. Neighbors she had once greeted at the well, men who had traded cattle with her husband, children who had played outside her home. Now their eyes burned with accusation. "She's a murderer!" someone shouted. Another woman shrieked, hurling a stone that struck near Elias's boot. "That's the woman who killed her husband." The mob's chorus swelled with hatred. Clara pressed her baby close, whispering a prayer as pebbles and mud pelted down. Elias's face did not change. He walked steadily on until the press of bodies grew too near. A boy lunged forward, reaching for the swaddled bundle. Clara screamed, "No!" In an instant, Elias turned, his body shielding the child. His hand flashed and the colt roared into the night sky. Smoke curled upward, thunder echoing off shuttered windows. The mob froze. Mothers yanked children back. Men muttered curses, but stepped aside. The boy stumbled, pale and wide-eyed. The mob that had moments before been ready to tear mother and child apart shrank beneath the bounty hunter's silent glare. "Did you see that?" someone whispered hoarsely. "He's protecting her. A bounty hunter guarding a murderer. What the hell is Cain doing?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd, disbelief and fear spreading like cracks in glass. Clara buried her face in Elias's chest, trembling with terror and relief. For the first time since her husband's death, someone had stood between her and the world's hatred. Not with words or pleas, but with steel. Elias holstered the revolver, his expression unreadable. He said nothing. Adjusting Clara in his arms, he reached for the reins of his black stallion tethered by the saloon. The horse snorted, stamping in the mud as if sensing the danger. Elias swung Clara into the saddle with practiced strength, keeping the child tight against her chest. In one fluid motion, he mounted behind, his arm locking around both mother and newborn. The crowd parted reluctantly, lanterns throwing their spite-filled faces into sharp relief, but none dared step closer. At the end of the street, Sheriff Hargrove appeared, his hat low, hand resting on his pistol. His lips curled in disdain as he watched Cain guide the horse forward. He said nothing, but his silence promised reckoning. Elias ignored him. With a hard tug on the reins, the stallion surged into the storm. Hooves pounded the soaked earth, scattering the mob. Curses followed them, but no one raised a hand to stop him. Clara leaned against Elias, her strength fading. Yet she felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat at her back. The cold air bit her skin, but she clung to the warmth of his coat and the safety of his arm. As the town lights dwindled behind them, and the open land stretched wide beneath the moon, a single thought struck Clara. In this place where every hand had turned against her, where even God seemed silent, one stranger had lifted her from death's floor and carried her through the fire of hatred. He had not asked her name. He had not asked why, and for the first time in months, she believed she and her child might live to see another dawn. Dry Creek faded into a smear of lantern glow on the horizon. The stallion's hooves pounded across open land, carrying Elias, Clara, and the child into the wide dark of Arizona territory. Behind them, the desert nights stretched endless, a tapestry of stars. Ahead lay sand, stone, and silence. The journey was unforgiving. They crossed cracked earth where the wind hissed like a serpent, climbed red ridges glowing faintly under moonlight, and rode through grasslands where coyotes howled like restless ghosts. Clara clung to the saddle, her arms wrapped tight around her newborn. Her body was frail, every breath a struggle, yet she never loosened her hold. Elias rode close, one arm steady around her, guiding the stallion with hands hardened by years on the trail. His face was set, carved against the wind. Days bled into nights, Elias moved with the discipline of a man who had survived too long alone. When Clara faltered, he lifted her gently down. When the baby whimpered, he wrapped it deeper into his coat, shielding it from the cold. At night, he built fires with quiet skill, sparks drifting upward to scatter among the stars. He hunted jackrabbits and quail with the bow slung across his back, cooking in silence. He fetched water from shallow creeks, coaxing what the land would give. Never once did he ask Clara for her name. Never once did he ask what crime had condemned her. His silence was steady, neither cruel nor kind, but his actions spoke louder than questions. He kept her alive. He kept her child alive. Clara watched him with quiet awe. Here was a man who carried death on his hip in the form of worn revolvers, yet who cradled her baby with a reverence that felt almost sacred. She wondered who he was when the guns were silent. She wondered what ghosts stirred in his eyes when the firelight caught them. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Clara sat near the flames, her child asleep in her arms. Elias sat sharpening his knife, each stroke slow, deliberate. The rasp of steel on stone was the only sound. Her thoughts drifted back to the night her world ended. The door breaking open, the shouts of men, gunfire splitting the dark. She remembered falling to her knees, her husband's blood soaking the floorboards, and then the sheriff arriving, calm and practiced, arranging the scene with a steady voice. By dawn, the neighbors believed her guilty. Witnesses were bribed, evidence twisted. By sunrise, she was behind bars, and her husband's ranch was already being discussed in backroom deals. Clara closed her eyes, tears slipping into her baby's hair. She wanted to tell Elias, to spill the truth, to beg him to believe her. But fear stopped her. Fear that he would see her as a burden, a woman dragging him into a war not his own. Shame stopped her, too, that she had been powerless to stop it, powerless to protect her husband, powerless to clear her own name. So she remained silent. She held the child closer, listening to the rasp of Elias's blade, the crackle of firewood, the call of nightbirds across the plain. Elias spoke no words, but his presence was a wall between her and the world. He was not tender, not gentle. Yet every fire he built, every strip of meat he set before her, every time he shifted the child into his arms so she could rest, these were gestures of their own kind of language. Clara realized silence was enough for now. Survival was enough. She did not know where Elias would take her or why he had chosen to carry her out of Dry Creek. But in a land where the law had marked her guilty, she knew one thing. Elias Kane was the only thing standing between her and the endless dark. The fire had burned low, its last embers glowing against the vast black of the desert. The wind hissed through the mesquite, carrying the dry scent of sage. Elias sat propped against his saddle, rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the horizon out of habit. Men like him rarely slept. Clara lay nearby, wrapped in a blanket, her newborn curled against her chest. She drifted in and out of uneasy dreams, her lips moving as words slipped into the night. At first, Elias ignored them until fragments cut clear through the silence. Daniel, the sheriff, the land, blood. Elias's jaw tightened. Her voice was raw, pleading with someone long gone. He shifted closer, crouching in the firelight. "What did you say?" he muttered, though she did not hear. The child stirred and quieted again. He sat back, turning her words over like stones in his palm. Sheriff, land, blood. Not the cries of guilt, but of someone robbed of everything. At dawn, Clara woke to the sound of Elias breaking camp, snuffing the fire, tightening straps, every motion precise. She tried to rise, still weak, but froze when his eyes locked on hers. "What did you dream?" he asked. Her lips parted, but no sound came. His voice cut harder. "I heard you. You called a man's name. Daniel. You said, 'The sheriff, land, blood.' Tell me what it means." Clara stared at the ground, clutching her child as though truth itself could steal him away. At last, her voice came low and uneven. "Daniel was my husband. We built our ranch with our own hands. every acre. The sheriff wanted it. He and his friends, men with money, men who wear respect like a mask, they wanted it. And when Daniel would not sell, they came in the night. Her breath hitched. They shot him before my eyes. They said if I spoke, they would kill the baby I carried. When the sheriff arrived, he told the neighbors I had shot Daniel in rage. His lies were so carefully spun, no one questioned him. By morning, I was behind bars, and the papers were already signed to steal the land. Her tears fell onto the baby's blanket. That is why he wants me gone. He will not stop until my name and my child's are buried in dirt. Elias stood still in the rising light, his face carved into stone. But inside, something shifted. Memories surged. The charred remains of his own homestead, the smell of blood and smoke, the bodies of his wife and little girl. He had come home too late, the raiders gone, the sheriff calling it justice served. Those men had been friends of the badge, never punished, never named. Listening to Clara, he felt the old rage burn through him again. A fire buried beneath years of killing for coin. Clara lifted her gaze, fear shining in her eyes. "Will you leave us now?" she whispered. "Now that you know the truth, that I carry death with me?" Elias looked at her a long moment. His expression did not change, but when he spoke, his words struck like flint. "We're not done with him." Clara blinked, her breath catching. He turned away, pulling the saddle cinched tight until the leather groaned. His tone carried no comfort, yet its weight was clear. "We're not done with that sheriff." Then he mounted, extending a hand to her. Clara hesitated only a heartbeat before placing hers in his. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she felt something stronger than fear. Not hope, not yet, but the certainty that Elias Kane would not run. Not from truth and not from the blood debt owed by a man who called himself the law. The desert wind carried the smell of dust and iron, a warning Elias did not ignore. He had seen the tracks, fresh hoof prints cutting across the plain, too many to be wanderers. Someone was hunting them. By the time the sun dipped behind the red cliffs, his hand never strayed far from the iron at his hip. Clara sensed it too. She clutched her baby close, her eyes darting at every rustle in the grass, every shadow stretching long in the fading light. She had learned enough in these days on the run to read Elias's silences. When his shoulders tensed, danger followed. The ambush came as stars pierced the twilight. A shot cracked through the stillness, shattering rock inches from Elias's head. The stallion reared, screaming. Clara cried out as torches flared in the darkness and men surged from the cliffs, rifles and pistols drawn. "Sheriff Hargrove's killers," one shouted. "Get the woman. Kill the brat." Elias moved before the words had finished. He hauled Clara from the saddle, thrusting her behind a fallen log. His revolver thundered, each shot deliberate, each man who fell a testament to a hand sharpened by years of death. But there were too many. Gunfire roared from above, bullets hissing like hornets, showering sparks and dirt. Clara crouched low, shielding her baby, her heart pounding so loud she thought it would burst. Elias fought like a shadow, firing with both hands, reloading in brutal rhythm. 3 men dropped, then 4. The rest wavered, but pressed on. One slipped through the chaos, crawling low through the grass. Clara's scream caught in her throat as the man rose behind her, knife flashing. He lunged not at her, but at the bundle in her arms. Time slowed. Elias saw it, the raised blade, the child's cry cutting the night. Instinct overtook thought. He hurled himself across the ground, slamming into Clara, his arms sweeping the baby from her grasp just as steel came down. The blade sliced his coat but missed flesh. He rolled, the baby pressed against his chest, his body shielding it completely. His revolver barked once, twice. The attacker collapsed, the knife falling harmlessly to the dirt. Clara gasped, trembling as Elias knelt in the firelight, cradling the child like the most fragile thing in the world. His broad frame curved protectively, his hand steady, his eyes locked on the baby with a softness she had never imagined in him. The baby quieted, its cries fading to whimpers. For a heartbeat, Elias's expression, usually stone, shifted. In the cold eyes of a man who had carried death for years, flickered something Clara thought long dead: tenderness. The last shots faded. The remaining outlaws fled into the dark, unwilling to face the hunter who did not miss. Silence returned, broken only by Clara's uneven breathing and the crackle of fire. Elias checked the child again before handing it gently back. His coat bore a slash from the knife, his hands blackened with powder. Yet his touch was careful, reverent. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to thank him, to tell him what it meant to see him shield her child with his own body. But no words came. She could only stare, her heart hammering with something dangerously close to awe. Later, after camp was rebuilt, Elias sat with the baby in his arms. He had insisted Clara rest, though she protested. Now she lay watching him through half-lidded eyes. The fire painted his face in shades of gold and shadow. His gun belt rested on the ground, forgotten. The baby stirred, and to Clara's astonishment, Elias began to hum a rough tune, so faint she wondered if she imagined it. His scarred hands rocked the child with a patience that seemed foreign to the man she thought she knew. Clara pressed a hand to her lips, emotion swelling. For days, she had seen him as nothing but iron and silence, a blade drawn against the world. But here, beneath desert stars, she glimpsed the truth. Beneath the scars, beneath the battles, Elias Kane carried a heart not yet destroyed. And as her eyes grew heavy, Clara realized with quiet shock that her own heart no longer belonged to her. The desert dawn came cold and brittle, a pale light spreading across the mesas like silver. Elias sat apart from the fire, back against a boulder, eyes fixed on the horizon where violet bled into blue. He had not slept. He rarely did. Instead, he counted the minutes by the soft breath of Clara's child. All night the thought gnawed at him. On Clara's head rested a bounty so high it could buy him land, a new horse, and enough whiskey to bury his ghosts forever. All he had to do was bring her in, deliver her to Dry Creek, hand her to the sheriff, and let the rope finish her. It would be easy, safe. For a man who had lived by coin and contract, it made sense. But each time he looked at the infant's face, the thought soured. Each time Clara's eyes met his, eyes that had stared down hatred and still clung to life, he felt the old rage stir. Rage at lawmen who called themselves righteous while they fed on blood and land. By midday, the decision weighed heavier than iron. That was when the rider appeared. He came up the canyon trail slow, his horse weary, but his posture too straight for a drifter. Elias knew before the face came clear. They had watched the sheriff call for her death, had seen his men fall upon her with the hunger of wolves, and they could no longer deny the corruption that had poisoned their streets. By the time the doctor arrived, people were already whispering words they had never dared before. That Clara Monroe had been innocent all along, that perhaps the law had been nothing but a mask for greed. Elias lay for weeks in a quiet cabin outside the town, his wounds tended by Clara's steady hands. She barely slept, nursing her newborn in the night and wiping the sweat from Elias's brow as fever raged. Many times she thought she would lose him, that the man who had carried her from darkness would slip away into the same silence that had taken her husband. But Elias fought, as he always had, and slowly strength returned to him. When at last he stood again, scarred but alive, Clara's tears came not from fear, but from relief. Together they left Dry Creek, the town that had judged her, the land that had swallowed their blood. It was no longer theirs to hold. They saddled the stallion, packed what little supplies they had, and rode out into the open wilderness. No one stopped them. Some watched, some bowed their heads in quiet shame, but no one dared speak. On the trail, they said nothing of their future at first. Words seemed fragile things, too weak to carry what had grown between them. But Elias's hand, rough and scarred, sometimes brushed against Clara's as they rode. And at night, when he held the baby so Clara could sleep, she would wake to the sound of his low voice, humming that same half-forgotten tune. They became, without speaking it aloud, a family, not bound by law or blood, but by the fire that had carried them through bullets and betrayal. Clara no longer feared that Elias would ask her name or her past. He did not need them. To him, she was simply the woman who had survived, the woman he had chosen. And to her, he was the man who had saved her, not once, but every day since. The desert stretched before them, endless and wild. The sun rose behind their backs as they rode farther from the town. The child nestled between them, sleeping against the rhythm of the horse's gait. From a distance, they were only shadows. Two riders and a small bundle of life, moving steadily across the horizon. Behind them, the echoes of gunfire and the sheriff's curses were already fading, carried away by the wind. Ahead lay only the unknown. But this time Clara did not fear it. She turned her head, resting it lightly against Elias's shoulder, and felt his arm tighten around her. Whatever waited beyond the desert, they would face it together. And as the three of them rode into the vastness, the land itself seemed to welcome them, not as fugitives, not as broken souls, but as a family born of blood, fire, and love. And so, under the endless sky of the American frontier, Clara, Elias, and their child rode into a new beginning. They left behind blood and betrayal, but carried with them something stronger than fear. Love born in the dust and tempered by fire. This is not just the end of their story. It is a reminder that even in the harshest corners of the Wild West, where the law was crooked and the land unforgiving, hearts could still choose courage, and love could still defy death. If this tale moved you, if you believe in stories where bullets missed but hearts did not, then join us. Under the endless sky of the American frontier, Clara, Elias, and their child rode into a new beginning. They left behind blood and betrayal but carried with them something stronger than fear. A love born in the dust and tempered by fire. This is not just the end of their story. It is a reminder that even in the harshest corners of the Wild West, where the law was crooked and the land unforgiving, hearts could still choose courage, and love could still defy death. Elias lay for weeks in a weathered cabin on the far edge of the valley, fall upon her with the hunger from the eyes of Dry Creek, and they could no longer deny the corruption that had poisoned their streets. Logs by the time the doctor arrived, the people were already whispering words they had never dared before. The air was warm but heavy. Monroe had been innocent all along. The fire in the stone hearth burning low as Clara had been nothing but a cradle and sickbed. Elias lay carrying the exhaustion of two cabins outside the town, tending to her newborn in the dark hours of Clara's steady fighting to keep Elias. She barely slept, nursing her newborn in the fever and wiping the sweat from Elias's brow. His skin gone pale and damp. Many times she thought she would lose him, as though each one might be his last. The man who had carried her from darkness would slip away. She fed the child with one hand while pressing a cool cloth to Elias's brow with the other, as he always had, whispering prayers. Slowly strength returned to girlhood. When at last he stood again, she thought she would lose him, scarred but alive, that the man who had carried her out of fire and blood would slip into the same silence. Together they left Dry Creek, the weight of the town that had judged her, yet Elias that had swallowed their blood. He fought as he no longer theirs to hold, not with fury but with a stubborn grit, packed what little supplies they had. Days bled and rode out into the open wilderness. Into days, and slowly, no one stopped them. Painfully, some watched. The color returned to his face in quiet shame, his voice steady, but no one dared and his speak. Body gathered strength. On the trail, again. They said when nothing at last of their future at first. Scarred but alive, words seemed fragile. Clara's tears came not from too fear, weak to carry what had from grown a relief so them. Deep it shook but her Elias's to the core. Hand. When the time came, they left Dry Creek sometimes behind, brushed against the town that had whispered against her, and at night, the land when he held the baby so Clara could sleep, no longer held she would wake to the sound of his low voice. She saddled the black stallion humming that same half-forgotten tune, packed what little food and clothing without speaking it aloud, and tied her meager belongings in a faded shawl. Not bound by law or Elias helped her mount, but by the fire lifting her and the baby with surprising steadiness. Clara no longer feared that Elias would ask her name. Together they rode out across the open wilderness. The wind tugging at Clara's hair. She was simply the woman who had survived, the child bundled warm the woman he had chosen. The people of Dry Creek, he was the man who had saved her. Not some once, stood on porches, but every day silent as the horse passed, their faces pale in the gray dawn light. A few turned their eyes away, ashamed of what they had allowed. One or two bowed their heads, as though in quiet apology, but no one spoke. No one dared. The sound of hooves carried them farther with each breath until the town was nothing more than a smear against the horizon. On the trail, they did not speak of where they were going or what they would become. Words felt too fragile for what lived between them now, too small to carry the weight of survival and sacrifice. But sometimes, as they rode side by side, Elias's scarred hand brushed lightly against Clara's, the faintest touch in the vastness of the plains. At night, by the glow of the fire, he would cradle the baby so she could rest. She often woke to the sound of his low voice, humming that same half-forgotten tune she had heard him murmur once before, the melody worn thin by time but steady as a heartbeat. In those quiet hours, Clara began to understand what they had become. They were no longer two broken souls bound only by circumstance. They were a family, unwritten, unspoken, not forged by law or blood, but by the fire they had walked through together, the fire that had not consumed them but reshaped them. She no longer feared that Elias might one day ask her to speak her past aloud, to name herself or confess her sins. He did not need those pieces of her. To him, she was the woman who had endured, the woman who still stood. And to her, Elias was not simply the man who had carried her from the wreckage. He was the man who saved her still, every day, in every moment, in every quiet act that told her without words, "You are not alone anymore." They had watched the sheriff call for her death, had seen his men fall upon her with the hunger of wolves, and they could no longer deny the corruption that had poisoned their streets. By the time the doctor arrived, people were already whispering words they had never dared before. That Clara Monroe had been innocent all along, that perhaps the law had been nothing but a mask for greed. Elias lay for weeks in a quiet cabin outside the town, his wounds tended by Clara's steady hands. She barely slept, nursing her newborn in the night and wiping the sweat from Elias's brow as fever raged. Many times she thought she would lose him, that the man who had carried her from darkness would slip away into the same silence that had taken her husband. But Elias fought, as he always had, and slowly strength returned to him. When at last he stood again, scarred but alive, Clara's tears came not from fear, but from relief. Together they left Dry Creek, the town that had judged her, the land that had swallowed their blood. It was no longer theirs to hold. They saddled the stallion, packed what little supplies they had, and rode out into the open wilderness. No one stopped them. Some watched, some bowed their heads in quiet shame, but no one dared speak. On the trail, they said nothing of their future at first. Words seemed fragile things, too weak to carry what had grown between them. But Elias's hand, rough and scarred, sometimes brushed against Clara's as they rode. And at night, when he held the baby so Clara could sleep, she would wake to the sound of his low voice, humming that same half-forgotten tune. They became, without speaking it aloud, a family, not bound by law or blood, but by the fire that had carried them through bullets and betrayal. Clara no longer feared that Elias would ask her name or her past. He did not need them. To him, she was simply the woman who had survived, the woman he had chosen. And to her, he was the man who had saved her, not once, but every day since.